Professor Warren Goldfarb, chairman of the philosophy department at Harvard University, is our guest panelist in this program. He specializes in logic, history of logic, and philosophy of mathematics, and has translated and edited the logical writings of Jacques Herbrand. He has also co-authored with Burton Drebin the decision problem and solvable classes of quantificational formulae. The program begins with a discussion of Professor Quine's early philosophical career at Harvard and consideration of his relationship with the logical positivists of the Vienna Circle, most notably with Rudolf Carnap. This background sets the stage for a thorough discussion of Quine's naturalism, and in particular, his naturalized epistemology. Questions about the famous two dogmas are raised, and then attention is drawn to his doctrines of extensionalism and ontological relativity. We now join the discussion in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Joining Professor Quine for this discussion are Warren Goldfarb, Professor of Philosophy at Harvard University, Paul Horwich, Professor of Philosophy at MIT, and Martin Davies, Wild Reader in Mental Philosophy at Oxford University. In 1932, the Quines set sail for Europe. Destination was Vienna. Herbert Feigl, who was at Harvard University from Vienna at that time, had suggested to Quine, who had already achieved acclaim as a logician, that the main action in logic would be found in Vienna, and perhaps in the person of Rudolf Carnap, who was ultimately to play a great role in Quine's development as a philosopher. Before going into the influence that the Vienna Circle had on your work, I'd like to ask you, what was the situation at Harvard at that time, particularly in the field of logic?
At that time, logic was very weak in America generally. Universities hardly, as far as I know, hardly any of them taught the subject. Harvard was looked to, prided itself on being perhaps the greatest center for logic in America. After I'd been there for a little while, I came to feel that this was, this profession reminded me of the Wizard of Oz. There was, I was learning virtually no logic that I hadn't already imbibed as an undergraduate from my unsupervised honors reading.
Who were the main characters at that time at Harvard?
In logic, the three names associated with logic were Whitehead, Clarence Irving Lewis, and Harry Scheffer. Whitehead, of course, with very good reason, because he and Bertrand Russell had done this monumental 3-volume work on mathematical logic, the work that was far and away the greatest thing in that subject, and virtually the only great thing that I'd become aware of up to then. Lewis had done many years earlier, in fact, as far back as 1918, the book had appeared, a survey of symbolic logic, in which he did a good job of reporting the developments at the hands of Peirce and Boole and the others, and to some small extent perhaps Frege. His teaching, he was perhaps my most influential teacher from a point of view of straight classroom contact. His course in Kant and his course in his own theory of knowledge. He wasn't teaching logic. What little logic I associated with him from reading, I was not sympathetic with because it was modal logic. In fact, he was very much the pioneer, the American pioneer or the pioneer, I should say, in the modal logic of necessity. Harry Sheffer was the one who was giving logic courses, but they were just altogether too thin. And there was, I got no inkling of the current excitement in Central Europe at the hands of Tarski and Łukasiewicz and others in Poland, and Hilbert, Ackermann, Bernays in Germany, Göttingen.
So you met Carnap in Europe in 1932, and you clearly found he had a lot to offer. In 1934, you gave a series of lectures on his program of logical syntax. Those lectures are very sympathetic to him, but pretty soon you found yourself having some differences with that program and with Carnap. I'd like to know, where did you first find your differences with Carnap? What were the initial difficulties you first found yourself running into in thinking about executing the program?
Yes, the first occasion, apparently, and I didn't learn this until just within the past few years, was as far back as March 1933, when I was there with Carnap and was getting so much stimulation and knowledge of philosophy from him. I didn't know that until it was turned up by Neil Tennant in a log that Carnap had kept in his methodical way, where day after day in Prague, when he wasn't going in to lecture, I would go out to where he lived, and we would discuss, because I was reading his Logical Syntax of Language in the German edition as it came out of the typewriter. It hadn't yet appeared. It wasn't to appear for another year. Carnap entered in this log that I had expressed some questions about analyticity, some doubt about it. And his reflection was that perhaps I was right in thinking, I'm not sure how accurately I remember this 3 or 4 line passage, but perhaps I was right in thinking that it was a matter of degree. Until this recent archaeological discovery, I thought of 1935, when I was writing Truth by Convention that came out in 36 for a Festschrift for Whitehead, as being my first manifestation, certainly, of that doubt. And then certainly by 39, 40, it had become really quite a firm doubt, and not just tentative misgivings.
I'd like to ask you about your attitude towards the positivist doctrine that metaphysics is meaningless. In discussing the so-called inverted spectrum hypothesis, the hypothesis that for all I know, other people are seeing red things the way I see green things and vice versa. In reaction to that, you said you thought this hypothesis would be unverifiable and therefore meaningless. And this sounds exactly the sort of thing that the hardline positivist would have said. Does this show that you are in fact a hardline positivist in this respect?
No, I can agree this is exactly what the hardline positivist would have said. No, I wouldn't say it, or I wouldn't mean that anyway. What I perhaps said, perhaps I started out saying that for one thing, it's unverifiable. And then I should have gone on to say, whether I did or not, that I can't even see how, by connecting it up with other hypotheses, getting it into the network of the web of belief, that it would link up indirectly with verification. It seemed to be simply inaccessible to scientific foreseeable scientific developments that we can project, that we can imagine and foresee. And that, it seems to me, should qualify something that purports to be a statement or a question of fact as meaningless in the positivist way.
So you do countenance then a class of meaningless, unverifiable metaphysical
yes,
sentences.
Yes, but it's way out, as I feel that this is, because I don't even consider it necessary for meaningfulness that a sentence be indirectly connectable with observation, that it be part of a network. I wouldn't require that the sentence be indirectly verifiable in this sense, that there be a set of sentences which together have what I've called critical mass, and that they together will imply an observationally testable situation, and would include the sentence in question, and would lose its critical mass when that was removed from the class. That would be a way of explaining what it would mean, perhaps, for a sentence to have empirical content at all. It would share empirical content in this this essential way. I wouldn't insist on that by any means, and I don't think that the bulk of sentences in history, or perhaps in various social sciences, nor perhaps all of them, even in serious, rigorous physics, meet even that test. And I don't think that for that reason they should be rejected as meaningless, because they are sentences that we have postulated or accepted. We've conjectured them, accepted them, because they seem to fit in so nicely with the theory that is working. Perhaps considerations of symmetry, perhaps it just seems to fill a nice little conceptual gap. And I think that furthermore they can be vital to the progress of science, because they are, I imagine, a very important, maybe overwhelmingly large part of the heuristics of the fashioning of worthwhile scientific hypotheses. That is to say, hypotheses that are worth testing, rather than just frittering away one's time on hypotheses that we ought to have thought were very unlikely to come out right when tested. So I think that's a vital part of science. And in fact, it's because of including all these that I can't envision any sharp demarcation. I'm with Karl Popper in this, between science and metaphysics in the privative sense.
That does raise a question, though. The positivists were very fond of demarcation criteria, not just to separate science from metaphysics, but also to separate science from pseudo-science. So the question is, how would you handle a question in which someone might want to bring into question something, for example, like psychoanalytic theory,
Yes.
as to whether that really had scientific status or not? And the positivists would handle such a question by their general criteria.
Yes.
How would you handle such a question?
Yes, well, I think the effect that consideration has on me is rather that I'm very suspicious of it and dubious of it. I can conceive that it might be helpful in some of the suggestions, some of the things, perhaps some of the things that are said about dreams, or some of the things that are said about inhibitions from earlier experiences, this way or that, can inspire somebody who's a more scientific temper to some constructive ideas that will go on. Maybe it's already happened, but as but the sort of cult that's developed and the trust that's been put into it as something therapeutic and worth spending an awful lot of time and money treating oneself to, that makes the thing certainly a great evil, and I'm not sympathetic with it at all. But I think to this extent that I think it's more nearly continuous with science than it should be for me to be single-mindedly inclined to brand it as meaningless.
The critics of verificationism used to devise sentences which were apparently meaningful, but which were cooked up in such a way as not to be susceptible of empirical confirmation or falsification either. I seem to recall some sentence along the lines of, there's a planet for whose existence we shall never have any evidence. Would you want to say the same about those sentences as you say about sentences in the outer reaches of mathematics, which is that overall simplicity can be our only guide?
No, I think the situation isn't as clear with those sentences, because those sentences might be related in the way that I was sketching through these various systematic kinships to such sentences, so as to be valuable in the theory that they're fitting in. They're fitting into the web of belief in such a way as to seem very likely to belong. And well, now in a way, those sentences of higher mathematics have that too in one direction, namely they are results of simply continuing to apply and extrapolate the grammar and lexicon that we've been needing for scientific purposes. And that's and that's a very clear and unconjectural link that they have, and it's the only reason, my only reason for taking them seriously as a part of science. So I think that I think in detail the structural connection is different.
What about the idea of taking the inverted spectrum hypothesis or its negation as just being a sentence in the outer reaches of phenomenology, where once again we'd say, well, we allow it to be meaningful because it's just using over again vocabulary that we use in more workaday circumstances, and we'll once again just let the truth value fall where it may in light of overall simplicity, I guess in which case you'd go for the denial of the inverted spectrum hypothesis.
Yes, well, that's an interesting suggestion, because I was about to wonder, all right, if we admit it, which way is our decision going to go on its truth value?
But people wonder about the outer reaches of mathematics as well.
Well, there we can settle for simplicity. I can't see simplicity coming into the act in this case, which is a commentary also on how independent it seems to be from anything scientific.
Right.
I wonder if you recognize a class of sentences that are meaningless in a more definitive way than simply not seeming to have any empirical consequences or the possibility of any fitting into the web of belief. I have in mind Wittgenstein's example, it is 5 o'clock on the sun.
Oh, good.
Where it looks as though, although grammatically okay, one feels like saying, well, 5 o'clock hasn't been defined for the sun. It doesn't make any sense to ask whether it's 5 o'clock on the sun.
Yes.
What's your reaction to kind of sentence?
Well, a characteristic of this kind of example, I suppose, is that we can prove on the basis of principles that we all unhesitatingly accept anyway, I should think, that there couldn't be any criterion, or any criterion that would fit in usefully with the rest of science in which those same terms are used. Maybe it's just that virtue of this, if it is a virtue, is it's a clearer case.
I see.
We've been talking about some of the historical influences on you just about Carnap, who does seem to have been predominant. But there was one very centrally influential book on all of the philosophers of the Vienna Circle, not just Carnap, and that was Wittgenstein's Tractatus. They all read it quite numerous times, and it clearly impacted all of their work. Did it have any direct effect on you and in your work?
I'm not aware of it having had any positive effect. I didn't like it. I read it early. I can't think how early. Very likely already when I was a graduate student there in 31, 32, although not in the course. No, I didn't like it. I didn't like the absoluteness of his atomism. Also, of course, I was put off somewhat by his being so blithe about construing quantification as just the infinite case of truth functions. The analogy is important, but I guess I may have felt at the time anyway that he wasn't taking the difficulties of actually acting on this into consideration, wasn't appreciating. Also, it seemed to me that his treatment of number in terms of relations was it was untidy, and I couldn't see why it wasn't clearly so inferior to the much simpler definition of number that Russell had already given, which followed Frege. So it was Wittgenstein's later work that I found more sympathetic.
The two dogmas that you reject in your article, two dogmas of empiricism, are the analytic-synthetic distinction, the distinction between matters of statements that are true in virtue of their meanings alone and statements that are true in virtue of the facts. And the other dogma is reductionism, the idea that every meaningful sentence has its own empirical content, can be reduced to observational facts in one way or another. I wanted to ask you about the relationship between your criticisms of these two doctrines. In particular, does your critique, your rejection of the analytic-synthetic distinction, play any role in the line of thought that takes you from the denial of reductionism to the web of belief to your renunciation of a priori knowledge?
Well, my holism was already present in two dogmas. In fact, in the two dogmas where everybody reads it, it's there's a footnote that to Duhem. Actually, that footnote is misleading in that I didn't know anything about Duhem when I presented two dogmas as a lecture, or when it first appeared as an article in the January 51. And it was Peter Hempel, that is Carl G. Hempel, and also independently Philip Frank, who having read that article, said how yes, oh yeah, that's like Duhem. And so I added that footnote when the thing was reprinted in From a Logical Point of View by way of giving Duhem credit. I didn't want to seem to be claiming this as something, some novel contribution. It's just a matter of presenting it as being the way things are. Anyway, so I had come to that somehow, and it's hard to say since it's not a very clean-cut idea. somewhere along the line from truth by convention to two dogmas. And then the web of belief, well, that was a very, I think, an admirable and catchy title due to my collaborator, Joe Ullian. But that's just more of the same. But then when I was writing two dogmas, I brought that in. Structurally, its position in that article is as one possible consideration to help account for the rather strange fact that people take analyticity, even analyticity across the board the way they do, so uncritically. That maybe it was a failure to appreciate that reductionism won't do, fail to appreciate holism. As for whether it was this holistic view that made me skeptical of analyticity in the first place, I just can't judge, because something like an appreciation of that can be vague and inarticulate enough so that it doesn't come out explicitly, and I had thought of it as such. It's the same. The two attitudes, the holism, or therefore anti-reductionism in that particular instance of reduction, and the skepticism about meaning and analyticity are so much of a piece. Incidentally, that anti-reductionism has certainly caused misunderstandings, because I am not against reductionism as such, for heaven's sake. I'm very fond of it. More reduction, the better. And it's just this particular case of it.
Could your the line of thought which involves rejecting the reductionism in this epistemological form, the reduction of any theoretical statement to observation statements, which goes from there to holism and the web of belief and the rejection of a priori knowledge, could that proceed independently of any critique of analyticity?
They're so closely meshed, it's hard to say, but I think just because of the developing situation, the circumstances, when these questions arose, it was certainly what I became clearly aware of was misgivings specifically over analyticity. That was because of the way Carnap was using it. But I thought of it then as an objection that, and still in two dogmas I thought of it as a matter of his not having given a sufficient, a satisfactory definition of his terms, of his term analyticity. But the difficulty of doing so then is of a piece with the holism.
Yeah. If he had managed to, or if someone had managed to give a characterization of analyticity from which it would not follow that an analytic truth could be known a priori, then would that conception of analyticity have been able to play the philosophical role that it was being asked to play prior to two dogmas?
You think of something like the definition of analyticity that I proposed in Roots of Reference.
For example, yes.
No, that's certainly unscathed. Yes.
Just going back to two dogmas for a moment, Freddie Eyre cited you as being responsible, or partly responsible, for the dismantling of logical positivism because of your twin attacks on the analytic synthetic distinction and reductionism in that paper. And we've spoken privately a bit about Freddie Eyre and his position at that time when you met him, and subsequently, as you observed, his philosophical connection to logical positivism and how it differed from your own. And you've expressed a willingness to say something about this. So would you tell us about that?
Well, it seemed to me in his influential first book, Language, Truth, and Logic, he came out interestingly in between the two phases of Carnap that it seemed to me so abruptly different. The Carnap of the logischer Aufbau, where he was very much the phenomenalist, and the later Carnap, which was where he's a well, he's taken on naturalism, along more specifically with his physicalism. In fact, it eases the transition from the earlier Carnap to the later one, and makes it more intelligible. I can't see quite how to what to pin it down to in the way of specific points. The book was impressive to me. The way so much in philosophy came under his criticism. The book from beginning to end focuses primarily on meaninglessness of metaphysics, and one philosophical, traditional philosophical question or issue after another is taken up, and then he argues, shows how it is hopelessly unempirical and out it goes. This is leading up directly, well, and so this makes for a close continuity again between the Vienna Circle of the later Carnap and the Wittgenstein of his days in England, where philosophy becomes, under Wittgenstein, a straight therapeutic undertaking, and philosophical problems are results of misuse of language that can be cured. The pointing out of of just the way that Eyre felt that language had gone wrong in these cases sometimes is the way he handles the questions and showing that they're meaningless. And he certainly produced something that gives the spirit of the Vienna Circle for the reader who runs. It's not intellectually exacting. It can be read and appreciated by wide circle, and was a very important book. Point of view of the history and geography of philosophy.
You've said that naturalism is one of the main components of your philosophy. That's the view, roughly speaking, that science is the only road to genuine knowledge. I'd like to ask you about this. Do you think that this naturalist doctrine can be established or in any way justified, or does it have to be a basic axiom?
No. I think perhaps the avenue has to be something like this: that you're engaged in science and have recognized, implicitly or explicitly, that the checkpoints of science, insofar as they exist, are checkpoints in observation through that channel of applying the observational setup. And you appreciate that without considering that what doesn't submit to that test is meaningless. Of course, I've just been arguing against that point of view, but insofar as there is a check, that's what it is. And so this would make one critical of the transcendental intrusions, as if there were other sources, either in a priori knowledge of the human or divine revelation as a support, underpinning for science and its method. But I feel that naturalism is and was very widespread. There's nothing new about this. I introduced the term, I adopted the term, introduced, I don't know which, naturalistic epistemology, or epistemology naturalized, for a specific application, namely getting away from that notion of a phenomenalistic reduction of all of scientific concepts in order to endow them with meaning, in favor of going at those questions from within science itself. And this is certainly a quite a clear and unmistakable contrast between my way of doing things and Carnap's Aufbau, to take extreme case. But on the other hand, as for naturalistic philosophy generally, it seems to me Hume was completely a naturalist. It's just that Hume didn't carry out reductions. And if he did carry them out, well, maybe he would have tried the same kind of thing that Carnap would have tried if he had had the same apparatus in the way of logic. And it seems to me most, as far as I know them, traditional philosophers were. But then there are these intrusions of in one philosopher after another. Of course, Berkeley with his divine intervention.
If some philosophers such as yourself say that science is the only road to genuine knowledge, naturalism is correct, and another philosopher says, I disagree, I don't think that naturalism is correct, is there any way to settle the dispute?
Well, perhaps there's not, because it would seem that the other philosopher in this case was not satisfied with empirical evidence, and was prepared rather to. No, I suppose this should be put the other way around. That he was prepared to welcome the kind of evidence that I couldn't admit, because it doesn't persuade me, because the kind of thing that would persuade me would be at least the illusion of empirical evidence in observation. So that he's got something which I suspect is just wrong turning and nonsense, but in any event, and of course that's taking a partisan position in this particular confrontation. But so that to take a symmetrical approach here, it would just be that inability on my part to appreciate his what he's counting as evidence.
In the
his
past,
ground.
You've distinguished between your naturalism and your empiricism.
No.
Well,
That's
your
good.
empiricism you have taken to be itself an empirical doctrine,
Yes.
which flows out of your naturalism. It's your naturalism which leads you to empiricism, which leads you to the view that the checkpoints should be observable data, but that you could imagine it's turning out that other sorts of data should be taken into account.
Well, I don't think I can, but I don't. I'm not getting this distinction between naturalism and empiricism. Things, when as I said, explaining my reason for introducing that phrase, epistemology naturalized, that was specifically for contrast with Carnap's building up and the traditional epistemologist before Carnap, but Carnap was the one who came closest to actually building it up, building up a phenomenal language in which science was not expressed, and then getting a language about the natural world, the physical world from that. And I'm taking the other, specifically the other approach, and going in to it from the standpoint of the physical world, the already accepted ontology itself. As far as I can see, the alternative that you're picturing would just be the sort of thing that I'm picturing as someone who is claiming a kind of mystical, or to me anyway, mysterious source of evidence, or kind of evidence, that I can't appreciate and that doesn't move me. And it would be, it might be a mystical, in some extreme case, a mystical insight on the part of some guru in the Himalayas.
I think it's in pursuit of truth. You say that empiricism is itself an empirical doctrine.
Oh, yes.
It's part of the web of belief.
Yes.
And might have to be abandoned. If it turned out, for example, that there was much more to clairvoyance or telepathy than we presently think, we would be led away from the view that the only reasonable checkpoints for scientific theory are observable data.
Oh, yes, well, that's
We'd
right.
have to accept certain other checkpoints.
Oh, good.
Maybe we'd even have to accept divine revelation.
Good. So let's see where this leaves us. I do think it's an empirical doctrine, I mean a scientific doctrine coming out of science, in that science tells us that our only avenue of evidence is through our senses, by the impact of physical objects and forces. And furthermore, that we might get evidence to the contrary, and it would be still evidence of the kind that does count for me, because it would be observable evidence. And I can well imagine evidence for clairvoyance just in the prediction of observable events, where I couldn't see what empirical basis in terms of known scientific forces he could have brought this about. And that would entail a revision not only of empiricism. Well, would it? Maybe we're getting a bifurcation here. What about that? It makes me wonder whether perhaps there's some difficulty in pinning empiricism on the yes, I think this is the trouble. Perhaps we should say that that empiricism goes on because I'm still settling only for corroboration in the observations. Yes, good. But what goes by the board is that the doctrine that the input is just through the senses, at least through the senses that we've thus far enumerated, and good. Well, I think the moral of this may be to have second thoughts about the statement that empiricism is a scientific result. Yes, that's good.
It's interesting. Perhaps you've already answered this question in what you just said, but I wanted to ask you about which prominent philosophers in the 20th century you would say are clearly not sympathetic to naturalism, don't endorse naturalism as you see it.
Well, I wonder. Now, certainly the ordinary language philosophers of England are as naturalistic as one could wish. At the other extreme, whatever philosophers there are who are religious apologists, trying still to support notions of revelation, would be an example of the contrary. Those are
Yes.
those are clear cases at both ends, I'd say. And then in between, what I would think of is just the philosophers who are still reluctant, even though not coming through with epistemological reductions of the kind that Carnap in the Aufbau was undertaking, something that's never been taken up so far as I know and pursued any further, or could be, but still are dissatisfied with the naturalization of epistemology, in that they apparently still feel that there's a problem there. And this would be a negative kind still of non-naturalism.
There's a question about where naturalism leaves one with respect to the issue of what is philosophy. One possibility that you have endorsed is that we think of philosophy as part of natural science. There are other possibilities. One might think that philosophy is simply discredited as a possible enterprise. Or one might think that philosophy, perhaps with Wittgenstein, the philosophy doesn't really aim at knowledge, but is a sort of therapeutic endeavor. Is there any particular reason for picking your characterization of philosophy?
No, that's not the characterization I intend. I may occasionally say things that sound very much like that, or even exactly like that. But what I mean is, philosophy is continuous with science. Philosophy is continuous with science. I can say that because that follows from the fact that my philosophy, at least, is continuous with science, and it's part of philosophy. And it may still be that, and I think it is, that my philosophy is more continuous with science than it is with some other parts of philosophy. And I don't think of this sort of thing, this scientific sort of philosophy, as being the whole of philosophy. There are other parts of philosophy, even that I respect, ethics. And of course, my position is that judgments of moral value, and for likewise aesthetic value, are not part of science, except the anthropology behind them is. And so I think of philosophy as quite a scattered, quite an aggregate. Oh, and I should add, I think of furthermore, even rather sympathetically, of English ordinary language philosophy as being philosophy. It's just that it's not enough of it.
I wanted to ask a question about Peter Strawson's paper, Two Conceptions of Philosophy, and the contrast between his naturalism and your naturalism. In that paper, Strawson says, what's this alternative conception? In other words, what's his conception of philosophy? Well, he says, the common as distinct from the scientific understanding is a complicated affair, embracing an indefinitely large range of ideas or concepts. He gives a long list of concepts and then says, the philosophical aim of those who adhere to my alternative conception of philosophy I take to be that of elucidating the character of such concepts as these and their interconnections. What do you make of this alternative conception of philosophy, and how does it differ from yours?
It's narrower. Yes, I would count this as decidedly as philosophy. And in fact, it seems to me it's the well, it's of a piece with the English ordinary language philosophy. These concepts he lists aren't very ordinary language, of course, but on the other hand, they're also not symbolic logic. And it's of a piece with that, and I think that's all philosophy, and it's even a lot. I think it's useful. I think it probably turns out to be very largely true, even. But I wouldn't limit it to that because I think there are well a lot more that goes on that interests me in my part of philosophy that doesn't come under that head, not analysis of concepts, but naturalized epistemology is one thing, and then such ventures, fruitful or not, as trying to get a more economical ontology, such contortions as getting bodies identified with portions of space-time, and then portions of space-time in turn with the classes of quadruples of numbers. That's, I think, decidedly philosophy, and it's not analysis of concepts. It doesn't seem in quite the same sense anyway. It's the kind of thing that would be regarded as further extension in an unaccustomed direction of natural science.
One of the things that Strawson stresses is the interconnections between concepts, and sometimes he speaks of this in terms of plotting the contours of a conceptual scheme. Part of what this involves is not just listing a whole lot of things that we do, but trying to identify, in some sense, though not, I think, a scientific sense particularly, what's basic about what we do. And so, for example, Strawson says that material bodies are basic particulars, not in the sense that they're basic for science, but in the sense that identification of material bodies, he says, is basic. Identification of other kinds of objects depends upon identification of material bodies, and not conversely. So he argues. Do you think there's any good prospect for theoretical results of this kind in philosophy?
Yes, this does sound good to me, and it's interesting, in particular, perhaps as an extension, and what seems to be an increasingly serious extension of ordinary language philosophy, where what is really coming into consideration is the structure of ordinary language, and not the structure in the linguist's sense, but the conceptual structure of our whole ordinary and even extraordinary, even scientific conception of the world. And again, very much a part of what I would regard as philosophy, and useful, and as conspicuously continuous with science.
Well, Paul asked earlier about whether naturalism could be justified. Perhaps within the naturalist camp there are these different projects. I wonder how one or other of those might be chosen ahead of the other. Strawson himself says of the two conceptions, each has its own worth, he says, and its own appeal. The choice between them is ultimately perhaps a matter of individual temperament. Do you think that's right?
The choice of them for what? One can very well choose music instead of, without being, without casting aspersions on philosophy. He can choose music instead, and one can do fiction instead of science. I think of the insistence on observation as the checkpoint, insofar as any checkpoint can be can exist. for what deserves the name of science. And although a great deal of what deserves the name of science can't be checked, directly or indirectly, I claim, still, when it is checked, it's going to be checked that way. And I think of this not as something to establish, but what distinguishes that scientific endeavor. Now, why would anybody want to do that? Of course, there are two frequent reasons. One is technology, and the other is just intellectual curiosity.
I suppose the question partly is how large a role science is going to play in one's intellectual life. Strawson, in effect, takes up the question that you've just asked, the question, for what? And he says, for one content to lead his life, at least his intellectual life, in the rarefied atmosphere of science, the choice on this test will go one way. For one content to lead his intellectual life in the muddier atmosphere of the more mundane, it will go the other way. Does that seem to you to be the key, whether one has a taste for the rarefied or a taste for the muddier?
Well, I'm wondering just what the other way is in this case, what he has in mind.
He just had in mind what he calls the more liberal or Catholic conception of philosophy.
Well, I think maybe he should shift to a more liberal or Catholic conception of science, and he wouldn't find the discrepancy.
Made it sound as if your naturalism consisted in your being prepared to call science only things that were subject to the checkpoint of observation. And that makes the doctrine sound somewhat terminological. It makes the doctrine sound as if it's just about what you are going to call science and what you're not going to call science, and who cares about terminology.
No, I don't think that is a naturalistic position.
I see.
I just think of that as the single distinguishing trait that of anything that any of us would think of as science in the broadest sense,
Yes.
including history. That if there is a checkpoint, it's there, and on the other hand, that I wouldn't expect one to call something science if the checkpoints were supernatural, the alleged checkpoints.
Do you think, is this a closer to what your naturalism consists in, that one simply oughtn't to believe things that haven't been subject to these...
Believe things that haven't been...
That aren't subject to those observational checkpoints?
No. No, on the contrary, I hold that a great deal of what's in science, in the broad sense, this broad sense, has no checkpoint, direct or indirect, and is still valuable, and valuable for science itself, and indirectly for prediction, but very indirectly, namely, as suggesting for further filling out some more hypotheses, which, unlike those first ones, do link up indirectly, systematically, with critical masses that can, as wholes, imply observations. And I think that science would be severely impoverished if the even the most liberal sort of positivism were put into effect.
But all these things fit into the web of belief in one way or another. All the things that you think could be believed.
Yes. So I don't insist on checkpoints. All I am insisting on here is negative, namely no checkpoints except observation.
I see. Where does that leave ethics?
Out of science, but
not out of
in
what we might-
philosophy and in respectable philosophy.
and in what we might legitimately believe. Doctrines.
Well, in another
might-
sense of believe, yes.
It has been noted by many philosophers, yourself included, that there are points of contact between your thinking and that of American pragmatism. Explicitly mentioned, for example, in the Dewey lecture, some agreements you have with Dewey. To what extent was pragmatism an actual influence on you?
I think, well, it's hard to think of any. It's hard to think of any, and I haven't been clear in my own mind on what constitutes pragmatism and what separates it from epistemology, from empiricism. I've thought about various tenets held by various card-carrying pragmatists, James, Dewey, Peirce, and they seem to be far enough from each other, at least as far from one another as any of them from some non-pragmatists, as far as they're usually classified. So I've never considered myself a pragmatist, and that's where that misleading paragraph at the end of Two Dogmas makes all the difference, where I'm picking up Carnap's phrase that he applied to his frameworks as being purely pragmatic, unlike the rest of science, which is empirical, and where I say, well, yes, I agree with Carnap about the character of these of what he's calling the framework, but of course I'm questioning the difference between that framework and the rest of science, and I'm saying that it's just that my pragmatism is more thoroughgoing. I would apply it across the board. But as it turned out, was an unfortunate way of putting it. I was just using his word. I haven't been opposed to pragmatism. It's just that I've wondered just what is distinctive about it, and so I've never considered myself a pragmatist.
You mentioned Carnap's notion of framework. One difference between you and Carnap that's come over and over again in various guises in the years is your attitude toward natural language as opposed to constructed language. Carnap almost never wants to deal with natural language. He always wants to define his notions only for constructed languages, where you always seem to want to pull him back into consideration of what languages people actually speak.
Yes. Yes, because I think of those constructions as superstructures for one or another particular, generally local, temporary purpose. And I think of axiom or postulate as in effect an indexical, an indicator word, namely something relative to the particular project of pedagogy that one's engaged in. Here's the way he's organizing this lore that he wants the reader to master. He's putting it in this order and deducing these from those. Somebody might find an even more efficient way of doing it at the other end too, and that there's nothing intrinsic about those things. The artificial language, of course, if one thinks primarily in terms of artificial languages, then there's no problem about analyticity. What's analytic is are the axioms and their consequences. So what is the point of the artificial language? Well, it depends, of course, on what it's used for. But at one point, I presented this artificial example. A positivist, a logical positivist named Ixman. I thought of that now. Ixman is making some point about the meaninglessness of metaphysics, in which he some metaphysical he's claiming that these things are meaningless, and his argument is that you could have all of science and all of our predictions and everything without any of these metaphysical questions even coming in. And to show this, at least with some examples, he says, imagine a tribe of Martians who speak a language of the following sort. And then he sets up an artificial language. He has to tell us a good deal about the syntax and vocabulary, but just certain parts, just the parts that are going to make his point, apropos of this particular metaphysical sentence that he's taking the props out from under. So he lays down these particular traits of the language. Whenever these things, there are these sentences, when these are true, these are true, and that's all he needs to make his point. All right, there's an artificial language, and there's a perfectly clear sense in which we can say what's analytic and what isn't, what's in the framework and what is empirical outside the framework, namely what Ixman has laid down. But what was the significance of his laying it down? Well, in this example, we know exactly what the significance was, and it doesn't throw any light on a more general notion of analytic. And it's this sort of consideration that makes me has made me empirical in my approach or my criticism of these semantical notions.
Besides your naturalism or empiricism, perhaps they're the same thing, you've singled out as central doctrines of your philosophy what you call your extensionalism, and also your skepticism about meaning. Could you tell us something about what these doctrines are and how they relate to one another?
Essentialism is what's involved in saying that classes that have the same members, everything that's true of a class is true of any of a class that has the same members as that class. In that sense, therefore, they are just one class, not two. And that's the extensionalism. The core of it, that's the law of extensionality. In an extensional language, any two predicates are interchangeable without, if they are true of the same objects, interchangeable without disturbing the truth value of the sentence in which they occur. So that for an extensional language, therefore, there's no difference between a property and a class. Properties are identical for such a theory, such a language, if and only if they have the same, if and only if they're true of the same things. Therefore, you might as well call them classes, and I do. And thus I don't recognize properties. Well, that's that's really the whole of essentialism. But when good Lord, I mean of extensionalism. But an important consequence of it is that there's no difficulty in an extensionalist language or an extensional language, we could say. No problem about the substitutivity of identity. That is to say that if two terms are names of the same thing, two singular terms are names of the same thing and nothing else, you can put one for the other in any context anywhere, and again, its truth will be undisturbed. It's hard to make sense, really, of that law failing if the things really are identical. But when you get away from extensional context, that law does seem continually to be threatened. And that's one of the practical virtues of trying to maintain a completely extensional theory.
Could you explain how this extensionalist position, denial that there are any properties over and above classes, how that relates to your skepticism about meaning?
It relates in this way. It's not enough to warrant the skepticism, not in itself altogether, but it does relate in this way that predicates that are true of the same things still may or may not have the same meaning. So it's so sameness of meaning is a distinction that goes beyond sameness of extension, sameness of objects denoted.
I wanted to ask about properties. In the fully austere ontology, where we just have classes of 4 tuples of real numbers, well, there, properties as traditionally conceived aren't recognized, but then nor are, I suppose, tables and mountains, fuzzy, blurred objects as normally conceived, recognized. But still, I sense that you're more sympathetic to tables and mountains than you are to properties. I wonder if you could say why.
Good. Yes. One has to settle for their fuzziness, since all empirically learned terms are vague that way, on their edges at least. And we can't do without them. And the way I'm inclined to accommodate them, however, is by taking as my theoretical ontology objects that are not fuzzy. And it would mean that that any of indefinitely many distinct from one another, mutually distinct bodies, real bodies, could be identified with that table. It would make no difference in all applications of our scientific theory, but from the theoretical point of view, we would consider ourselves to be talking about one of that multitude and not all of them.
Well, as for properties, I can understand the antipathy to properties, particularly if properties are seen as related to extensions as sense to reference, using Frege's terminology, because properties would come under the scope of skepticism about meaning in that case. What about the alternative conception of properties, where properties are thought of as lying in between a Fregean sense and extension? How do you feel about admitting those to your ontology?
No, I'm against it, and my objection is again just over the principle of individuation. Of when what I would want would be an explanation, a clear one, of just when to say of property A and property B in that sense that they're the same property.
And you're skeptical about that?
I don't know any way of doing it, yeah.
Right. Supposing the scientists were more certain that they needed properties than they were of any account they could offer you just now of the individuation conditions for properties, and so they just set that as a research project. Would that be an okay way to proceed?
Yes, it would. It would.
And it seems to be the way people do proceed.
Well, it would, yes, and in order to proceed that way, of course, they would have to be thinking in terms of the particular, to me, very mysterious situations where they felt they couldn't do without them. And then that's what they'd be doing in their continuing investigation would be to try to sharpen, define some concept that would serve that purpose, and that could appropriately then be called properties. The situation could be worse still if the familiar situation of course, in theoretical physics notably, is to introduce a new term for a technical purpose without giving any definition at all, any clear definition. The names for the elementary particles, without exception, are in that status. They're not defined. We're told a lot of things about them, enough so that one can get on. Conceivably, if there was something that might appropriately be called properties that seem to be needed in science, they might even be brought in that way, and we would learn to put up with them by mastering all the things that can usefully be said about them, even though everyone was at a loss to define them. I'd face it. It would be, of course, but one always wishes for something clearer and more elegant, but nature gets in there sometimes and prevents it.
I wonder whether there'd be another point at which properties might need to come in. Those who see events as the terms in causal relations are often driven to say something a little bit more, which is that some of the properties of an event are causally efficacious, as it's said, other properties of the event not. And just to be able to say that on the face of it seems to be a matter of quantifying over properties.
Yes. Well, the way I handle that one is that I take the events as extensional. And in fact, I do, in general, think of a physical object as the, in the most general sense, as the content of some portion of space-time. It needn't be a continuous portion at all. It could be scattered. It could be sugar, for instance, as an object for me, is a single physical object. It's all the sugar in the world, past, present, future. Or, of course, one could equally just identify it with the portions of space-time that it takes up. That's purely a verbal difference at this point, it seems to me. I think of events as physical objects in that sense, and as extensional. And then the question arises, the question that you raised. Here you have an event of let's see. I remember Davidson had an example that brought this out. If I could, here's some sort of a contrivance that's rotating. That's right, and heating up. The heating up causes a bit of ice to melt in the immediate environment. As we say, the heating up caused that. There's the property in a broad sense. But the heating up in this case and the rotating are inseparable. So what I would say is, yes, so far as this, that although it's strange, and after strange usage, and after all, I'm not doing philosophy of ordinary language, but rather I prefer to be doing these things in the spirit of mathematicians who will bring in new symbols and new terms just in order to clarify or what they're doing or make it simpler and easier to follow. I would, as far as I can see, it would fit all the purposes of science to make the following unidiomatic departure and say that, yes, that time the spinning melted the ice. The spinning of the event, the spinning of that wheel melted the ice because the heating of the wheel and the spinning of the wheel were both what the wheel was doing, was the state of the wheel. No harm, because the fact remains that our general law, that nearby heating melts ice, stands, and there's no suggestion of a law that some nearby spinning outsize.
Although I suppose you'd be unlucky if all the spinnings were heatings and all the heatings were spinnings.
Yes, well, that would pose a problem which scientists would be eager to get into. Just why is that? But quite, yes.
Right. So you're not inclined to go down the path of saying that the heating, which is a spinning on this occasion, causes the ice to melt, causes Quay heating the ice to melt, although it doesn't cause Quay spinning the ice to melt. That's a path
no.
which would appeal to some, I think.
Yes, well, who?
That was, or to some, I can imagine
Oh, yeah,
philosophers who would go down that road.
Yes, so, well, that would be a good day-to-day vernacular way of doing it, despite of the non-vernacular status of Quay. But I wouldn't, because that brings in concepts that I don't think we need, and that I find it clear to avoid.
I'm going to quit while I'm ahead, I think.
About ontology, you share with Carnap certain basic predilection for wanting to rob certain questions of their force. For example, the question, what is an ordered pair really? Right? Now, Carnap, one of, I think, his main motivations is to make sure that those sorts of questions don't make sense.
Yes.
And he has this elaborate notion of framework and what's in a framework and what's outside a framework that does that work for him. So how do you rob that kind of question?
Well, I think I'd agree with Carnap in that, not framework, no, but that's right. But I would agree with his conclusion. I would say, I think the trouble with this is that we're using a term that hasn't been sufficiently, it hasn't been either defined or sufficiently described to cover the particular circumstance that we're questioning. So that in that sense, it's a meaningless question.
But as you have said, there is no entity without identity. So you have to do something.
Yes, but which entity is it? Of course, that begs the question again, but I don't see how there's any dodging that one. The ordered pair can be defined serviceably in any number of ways, and there are several ways that have come into the literature, and it doesn't matter which ones you use, just so you can prove the basic law of the ordered pair, that xy is identical with zw if and only if x is identical with z and y with w. So for practical purposes, the meaning of ordered pair is just that. Then, in order, for the sake of and commonly we can leave it at that in practice, and do. And there's a corresponding situation well known in the case of saying what numbers are, what the positive integers are. Different ways of doing it, all of which are perfectly good, and it doesn't matter which. And then there are two ways of looking at that situation, in both the case of the pair and the numbers. Namely, one way is, yes, here we've got this ambiguous term, ordered pair, or the many kinds of ordered pair. But I think that philosophically the more straightforward way is in this case, elimination. And say, now we've shown, here we've defined ordered pair, we've shown we're not going to need to assume as an irreducible notion the notion of ordered pair, because we've got other notions here which, if we put them together in the right combination, will do the same trick. So let's do that, and there are no such things as pairs. Do the same thing about numbers. There are no such things as the positive integers. We're just talking about these sets. But then it's awkward to keep, we need a name, a short name for these little constructions that are serving as stand-ins for the pair. And so what better name, since we've already freed the term ordered pair. It doesn't refer to anything anymore. Those are gone. Let's reuse it. It's another kind of economy. So that's the way I suggest looking at these situations.
Is there, do you see any relationship between the particular situation one is in here, in thinking about what numbers are or what an ordered pair is, and your general doctrine of ontological relativity?
That's an interesting thought. I hadn't. Well, yes, there certainly is, in very broad terms. The point about ontological relativity was that there are certain functions, tagging functions, you might say, which our various so-called objects were performing, but serving really, as far as the logical structure or even the empirical support and checkpoints of our theory is concerned, mere nodes in the logical structure. Yes. So that we can reshuffle these objects, put in any others that are in one-one correlation with them. They serve that purpose just as well. So if we had some systematic way of naming these nodes, neutral names, we could just put those in and get rid of all these other names for objects. However, we have no systematic way of naming those nodes. The only thing we do is name them in our unsystematic way, and so we have these various terms for these various objects, and we talk about rabbits and this and that. But in talking about rabbits, cats, etc., we might just as well might leave out even the just as well be talking about cat complements and rabbit complements and the like. So there's good parallel.
Would the following, though, be something of a difference? In my own language, I'm of course using my own language. I can't use any other one. And I can think to myself, well, I wonder whether the number one is such and such a set, or whether it is such and such a different set. Which of these identity statements should I believe? And it seems to me to be a genuine question. But if I contrast that with the question, I wonder whether my word, or my linguistic expression, the number one, really does refer to the number one. That doesn't seem in the same way as if it could be a genuine question for me. It seems a trivial matter of what the word refers to means, that my expression, the number one, does for me pick out the number one.
Well, but then it raises the question, and it refers to the number one in what sense of number one? In the case of abstract objects like the number one, it seems to me that ontological relativity doesn't even, I think it doesn't even need to seem counterintuitive. Frege, I seem to remember, raised the question or mentioned the question or the possibility. What is the number one? It could be Julius Caesar. Doesn't matter. He came that he went at least that far to into ontological relativity, and then Ramsey with his what have come since his day to be called Ramsey sentences rather brings out that point again for abstract objects, it seems fairly intuitive that even that abstract objects are brought in there just as stopping points or to bring things together. It wouldn't matter. Well, of course, we know it doesn't matter how we go on and artificially define these numbers, as long as we get the behavior out of them, the properties that make them useful in application, and formally those properties are just the properties of a progression, a sequence, the kind called a progression. But there's an example that I've used. Two physicists who time out. Did I do this before? I know I mentioned it, but I'm not sure I did it, about the neutrino and the physicists.
No, you didn't.
Good.
You didn't.
Okay.
No.
Well, this yes, this I think brings out some of the spirit of it. There's a crisis in physics, and something has to be done in revising the theory or supplementing it. One physicist suggests maybe we need a new particle. In fact, two physicists arrive at that idea of introducing a new particle that with certain properties that will help clear up the paradox. But one of them brings in a particle that has some rest mass, and the other one brings in a particle that has no rest mass. But they both apply the same word, neutrino, and it seems to me it presents no problem to say that there's clearly no meaning to the question whether A, they are talking about the same particle but disagree in its properties, or B, they're talking about different particles. One has a rest mass, the other hasn't, but they happen to have given it the same name. No difference. And well, no, I think that applies again to the example of the numbers. Yes, the numbers, and to the example of the ordered pairs. That one has certain services that the case of the ordered pair is I think particularly conspicuous this way, because ordered pair isn't even a common sense notion to the extent that 1, 2, 3 are, and it's all that's wanted is something that is going to carry the individuality of both x and y, and not vice versa, and some further entity then in addition to the x and the y. Anything will do, and then they cast about and find, yeah, here's something it'll do. There's a little class of two members. It's easy to describe. It's not just a class with the members x and y, but a little more complicated. Someone else comes up with an equally simple one, but a different one, and that's a situation where it doesn't matter. You have this function in the sense of service, not in the mathematical sense, to be performed, and anything will do in the pinch. And then the sweeping theory, finally, of ontological relativity is that that's the way with all reference. But what makes it, I say, counterintuitive to all of us is when it's not a question of abstract objects anymore, like ordered pairs and numbers, but sensible objects. So this is where one has to consider and keep in mind that the sensory associations are undisturbed in all this reshuffling of objects in the course of ontological relativity, one-to-one reinterpretations. The sensory connotations remain, and when a body ends up being identified or supplanted, as you prefer, either way, by a class of quadruples of numbers, the sensory qualities of that body, the qualities by which you learned it through ostension or whatever, carry over to that quadruple, that class of quadruples of numbers. So that it's a matter of shifting one's emphasis from the object to the sentence, ultimately to the observation sentences, insofar as they're objects that we've learned by ostension, objects whose names we've learned by ostension. And those go along unaffected. What the theory of ontological relativity brings out is just that really the entity, the objecthood is not not really what matters here. The two things that do matter are one, all this bundle of sensory qualities, to put the thing in mentalistic terms, all the association, when it comes to neurally, with the sensory input. That's one of the two things that matter. And the other thing that matters is the role it plays, the service it performs as a node in the theoretical structure, the logical structure of the scientific theory. And then what the thesis of ontological relativity brings out is these are two separate purposes and can be separated, even be separated ontologically. In that the ontology can be reshuffled at will to within one-to-one for the one, and on the other hand, the sensory input stays put.
In your long career as a teacher and professor, you must have encountered a great number of students who have gone on, some within philosophy and some outside of philosophy, to pursue careers. Does anyone in particular, or do any of them in particular, stand out in your mind as?
Oh, yes, indeed. Of course, of the earlier ones, Donald Davidson. Then in logic, there have been a few, certainly. Well, not so much my students. They've gone successfully into computer theory and the like, but philosophers, later generations, of course, I think of Dogfinn Philistal and Roger Gibson. Those here I'm mentioning ones that have gone on, carrying on more or less my point of view.
Mm-hmm.